Hi, welcome back. In today's video, we will see how to call SOAP APIs from MuleSoft. So we'll call the SOAP API in two ways. One by using web service consumer, which needs a WSDL file to read the API information. And in another way, we'll use HTTP request component. So have got a public service, the calculator service available online. So we are going to use this service to call the SOAP APIs. So there is a WSDL link and the API information is available there. So if you click on the WSDL link, you get WSDL file. Here is where you get all the information related to APIs. So here we can see the service name, what service is available and the related addresses. And also if you go to the address, you can see all the available operations. For example, for calculator service, there are 4 operations available. We can add, subtract or multiply, or we can also divide the numbers. So this is how the API information looks like. So this link will give the information related to the API. So we have all the information that we need to build the API request. So WSDL file have all the information and we can use those information and can build a API call. So this is the service WSDL link. For now we can see the request body. Let's copy the request body. Here you can see we have all the information that we need to build the request. Host information is available, the path is there. Yeah, this is the path, and it's a post API, right? And also we have a request body. So let's copy the request body and paste it as it is. So it's in XML format. So let's select XML and just paste the request. Yes, let's try to call it and see what we get. We are getting success response, but not in the way we expected because we are trying to add integers. Okay, we have not given the integer information, right? Let's give some number. 2 plus 3, it should be 5. Yeah. It's a 200 success, but not the way we expected. Yeah, it should be post HTTP method. So after changing to post method, we are seeing unsupported media type. That means the request that we are supplying is not matching the media type they are expecting, right? If you see the content type for the API call that we used, it's application XML. Let's check the information related to the calculator service. It's something different. It's not just application XML, right? So it is text XML. So there is a difference in the content type. So we are getting media type not supported. So let's add the content type information and try to call the request again. Content type, let's try to call the API. Yeah, now we are getting the response as expected. So we are able to add the integers, right? It's 9 and it's working as expected. So we are able to call the calculator service successfully by giving XML input. So let's try to call the same API from MuleSoft. So there is a project, a SOAP API project created, and also have a Mule configuration file created. So let's use the same and call the SOAP API from this configuration file. So let's click on the configuration file. Let's use listener to start build the API. Listener will listen to HTTP request, and let's use the default values. It's localhost 8081. Just leave the default values as it is. Click on OK, and let's give some path. Let's say SOAP for now. Yeah, listener is ready to listen to HTTP request. So let's use the consumer, web service consumer, to call the SOAP API. So we are going to use web service consumer to call the SOAP API. So let's drag and drop the consumer component. So in order to use this, we have to have the WSDL file. So if we click on the configuration, it is asking for the WSDL location. It gives us an option to select the SOAP version. By default it's SOAP 11, and in order to connect to services, we need to give the WSDL location so that the consumer component can read the information related to the APIs. So let's give the WSDL file location. So this file will have the information, all the information that consumer component can use to establish the connection. So as soon as we give the WSDL location, the consumer component is able to identify the details of services and all the available address, so on. So let's search for service and see how many options we have here. In this WSDL file, we just have calculator service here. So, and from this is where the consumer component is identifying the service information, and also ports and address. All the informations are auto populated based on the WSDL file. So this is the same address that we have used to call the calculator service. So let's click on OK. So now we have all the information that we need to establish the connection. But here we have an option where we can define the operation, which operation we want to use, or which operation we want to call in the API. So there are 4 options here: add, subtract, multiply, and divide. So for now, let's use add. So we have established the connection, given the information related to the connection, and also we are saying which operation we want to call. And next we have to give the request body, right? These are the information that we have given in order to call the API from post1 as well, right? So this is the request body. Let's copy the information and paste it as it is. Yeah, paste the request body, and it's not expression type, so uncheck FX. Let's use transfer message to build the output payload. So let's for now, let's give the output in JSON format. So we are getting the payload from the consumer component. So we are printing the payload as it is and giving it to user. So this is, so this is a path, SOAP, and the listener component is listening to localhost 8081, and SOAP is the path. So let it deploy. Okay, the application is deployed. So let's run the API. We are getting add result as 0. So it is not working as expected, because when we called the real service, we were getting 9, because we are trying to add 2 plus 7, it should be 9, but we are not getting the add result as expected. So the request information is not proper. So let's check what's happening. Let's copy the request body and see if we are passing the information as expected. If we check the configuration information, the consumer component information, we are already defining the SOAP version. So the information related to the SOAP namespace are already available as part of the configuration. So we don't have to give those information again as part of request body. So let's remove the SOAP namespace related information. So just let's try to just give the information that is related to the operations. So now we are selecting add operation. So let's use the request body that is a specific for add operation. So the application is deployed. So let's run and see if we are getting response as expected. Looks like there is connectivity issue. Sometimes it fails to connect to calculator service, and let's try again. Yeah, now we are getting the add result as expected. 7 plus 2 is 9, and we are getting the response properly. So previously we were giving the information that are related to the SOAP namespace. Since it was already part of the basic configuration, we don't have to give the same information again. So let's try to use some different operation and see if we are getting the response. We have used multiply operation, but the request body doesn't say about multiply operation, so let's change it. Previously it was add, and we were using add operation, so we have changed it to multiply. We should be able to see the multiplied result now. It should be 14 now. 7 into 2 is 14. Yes, the multiply operation is also working properly. So we have used web service consumer component and using the WSDL file to establish the connection, and we were able to call the SOAP API successfully. So let's try to get the response in XML format. Just change the output type from JSON to XML. Yeah, we are getting the response in XML. Okay, now we have used the consumer component, but the request body that we have given is hard-coded value. We don't usually use this way. We have to build the request properly. Maybe we can get the input from variable or from different attributes or from different places. We should be able to get the values from outside components and build the request for the API. So let's remove it and let's try to build the payload for this request payload. So this is the payload that we have to build now, where we can take the input from request parameters, or we can take from payload as well. So let's see how to build the request body, something like this. Let's use transfer message component. Okay, now we are going to use this transfer message to build the request body for SOAP API. So if you're comfortable with the DataWeave language, you can use the expressions here and build the request. So but for now, let's use DataWeave Playground to build the request. So previously we have used hard-coded payload to call the API. So now let's build the request so that we can take input from attributes or from variables or payload, so on. So let's try to build the request body now. So this is the XML request that we are going to build. So let's start with the namespace, because these multiply and int a, b, all these are identified as part of namespace. So that's where these attributes are available. So let's start with the namespace. Let's name the namespace, like you can give a custom name. So this is the namespace where this multiply attribute is available, right? So this is the symbol that we are going to use to access the attributes. Add, you can use multiply or the different operations based on your requirement. Let's use add for now. Int a. For now, let's give some hard-coded values, but later we can read the values from payload or variables. Int b. Okay, let's wrap integers inside okay, we are getting the response in JSON, but we want to get the response in XML format, right? Let's change the output format to XML. Yes, now we are getting int a and int b for add operation. So here we can see that we are getting the namespace where the attribute is available and also the integer information. So this is the way we can build the request body. So in this example, we just have one namespace, but in real APIs, you may get multiple namespaces. So you have to identify the namespace and see where exactly your attribute is present. You have to use that particular namespace in order to access those attributes. So now we have copied the data weave expression and pasted in the transfer message as it is. So we are building the input payload. So let's remove the hard-coded value and give the request body as payload. So we are building the payload and using the same to call the calculator service. Let's wait for deployment. Looks like some connectivity issues. Cancel and let's call it again. We are okay. The reason we are not getting the response as expected, because in the input payload we have add operation, but in the consumer component we have used multiply. So let's change the operation name multiply to match the operation that we are using in the consumer. So the payload is multiply and the operation is also multiply. Now we should be able to see the response properly now. So let's wait for deployment. I think it's taking time. Looks like connectivity issues. Yes, there are some connectivity issues when connecting to calculator service. Yes, now we are getting the multiplied result 10 into 20 because we have used hard-coded values. So when multiplied, we are getting the response. So we don't usually use hard-coded values. So let's read it as part of query parameters. If you are passing the input as part of payload, you can just use payload dot your variable name. But in this case, let's try to read the integer values as part of query parameters. So let's pass the query parameters and read it here and use it for the calculations. So let it deploy. We are already passing the query parameters. We are giving 4 into 5, it should be 20. Yeah, there are connectivity issues, but now we are getting the response. So 4 into 4, 16. So it is now taking the input from query parameters and using it for multiply operations. So we have built the request body and have seen how to use the web service consumer to call the SOAP API by using the WSDL file. So it has a SOAP version, and from WSDL file we were able to read all the information that we need to establish the connection. So we just have to give the operation and the input request. So we were able to get the response successfully as expected. So this is one way of calling the SOAP API. There is another way to call the API by using HTTP request. So sometimes we get WSDL files which are not supported in the web service consumers because of the data mismatch or the version or something. So in that case, we will use HTTP request to make a call to SOAP APIs. So let's see how to call the same API by using HTTP request. Because consumer was using the WSDL file directly and was reading all the information for connection, host, port, service, and all the information from WSDL file. But in HTTP request, we have to explicitly give all the information that we need to call the API. That's the only difference. So let's check the real API and see what all information we need to give as part of configuration. We have host and path information with us. So let's use the same and give the configuration information. Let's name the request configuration. HTTP host information we have. Let's add the host information. It's HTTP post, and path is calculator, and yeah, we have given the information needed for connection, host, port, path, and all the information. And also we have the payload. So let's copy the payload, add it here again. Let's try the same way, like without expressions. We don't have any parameters to give, but we have header information to give, right? We have to give the content type explicitly to tell what format we are giving the input. Otherwise, we will get media type unsupported. We are giving the content type information to avoid unsupported media type exception. And now we have all the information that we need to call the API. So we are giving the response again in XML format. So we are getting the payload from this request call, and we are giving the same output to the user. So same payload we are giving it to the user. right? Let's run the application. Okay, we don't have to give the query parameters because we are not using it. Yes, we are getting the response. 8 plus 7, 15 we are getting. It's a add operation, right? We are getting the response as expected. If you observe previously, when we are using the consumer component, we were not giving the SOAP attributes, right? We were not giving SOAP envelope or body because the SOAP namespace informations were already there with the consumer component. So we have removed the SOAP attributes. So we just used the information related to the operation. But here we are giving the SOAP namespace attributes and information as well, because this request component will not have any information related to the SOAP namespace. So that's the reason there is slight difference between the payload that we have built previously and what we are building now. So previously we did not have the information related to SOAP namespace, SOAP envelope or body we did not have. Okay, when we are using the request component, we have to give this information as well. So there is one more namespace for SOAP. Okay, let's identify where is namespace, and for SOAP, and copy the link and define the namespace variable. So now we have the SOAP namespace. So now we know where exactly the SOAP attributes are available. Let's use the same variable, SOAP variable, to build the request, envelope and body. Okay, we'll use the same namespace to get the attribute information. It should be envelope and next body. So these are the two attributes information that we have to give to make the API request. So we are building the request that is matching our requirement. So let's use the same and try to call the real API, because if we are expecting this payload to work in the MuleSoft API, it should work in the real API call as well, right? So let's paste it and try to call. We are getting the error. That means something is wrong in the request that we have built. It is saying that a request format is invalid. The SOAP envelope or SOAP body is invalid. There are issues with the SOAP server. So it should be capital envelope, right? It is saying there is an issue with the attribute format. Let's change to capital letters and try to copy paste it here and try to call the real service. And now we are getting the response successfully. And if you observe here, these integer variables are also available inside this namespace, temp URI namespace. And let's try to remove this namespace reference and see what happens. So let's copy this information. Now these integer attributes are not linked with the namespace. Let's try to call it. We'll not get the response, right? We did not get the response add result as expected. So let's try to revert it back and see. Okay, we have to add for end tag as well, like properly. Yes, now we are getting the response. That means it's very important to identify the attributes within that specific namespace with the variables that we have used for that specific namespace. This cal that we have used for the temp URI namespace. So let's try to read the variables from attributes query parameters. Yeah, just like how we read it previously. So let's read it from query params A and B. So this way it's important to define the namespace properly and refer that particular attribute that is linked for the proper namespace. Yeah, now we are building the request payload. So let's use the payload to call the service. So the only difference for this request and the consumer component request is that here we are giving the SOAP namespace information, the attribute information from SOAP namespace, but previously we were not giving that because the consumer component already had those SOAP version and other information. Okay, there is an okay, let's give the input and it's working as expected. Yes, now it's reading the input from query parameters and it's working fine. So yes, in this session we have specifically seen how to use the consumer component and what is the difference between the consumer and request component when calling the SOAP API. As we already have two flows, let's try to combine the response for both of them. So let's save the consumer output as a response 1 and use flow reference to call the consumer flow, so that we can call the API from request component also from consumer, and we can combine the response from both the API calls. Let's try to concatenate both the response. So response 1 is the response from the consumer component. This is from multiply operation, and from request component we are trying to add the input. We are getting just the multiplied response. Yeah, this is because we have the same structure for both the response, so the response is getting overwritten. Let's try to build differently. So let's try to have both the response like individually. Response 2 is from HTTP request component and response 1 from consumer component. Let it get deployed. Now we should be able to see the response from both the components. Yes, there is a add result and also multiplied result for the same input that we are passing. 4 plus 8, it's 12, and 4 into 8, it is 32. So now we are calling, we are reading the query parameters and using HTTP request and also web consumer component to call the SOAP APIs. And finally we are combining the response and getting the response as expected. So today we have seen how to use web service consumer and HTTP request component to call the SOAP API. So that's it for today. Thank you. See you in next session.